Welcome, everybody.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for coming out today. We are very fortunate to have Dr. George Siemens from Athabasca University here at UVic. He will be speaking on the fragmentation of higher education. And George is one of the world experts on MOOCs and the creator of the connectivism theory. So I would like to welcome you and thanks for your time. I do have a couple of housekeeping bits that I'd like to share with everyone. We are going to be recording and beaming out this talk. If you do want to ask any questions, there is a mic in front of you for during the question period. You can push the button and you will either be turning red if you have the mic and the camera will turn to you, or if it's blinking, it means you're queued, and so you will be the next one to appear when the first person releases his or her mic. So we also have sponsors I'd like to acknowledge. We have the UVic Learning and Teaching Center, who has sponsored this event. Also UVic Systems, who have put a lot of time with their staffing to support this event, and the UBC and UVic Island Medical Program staff for allowing us to use their space and to help with the operations. Also, we have a Tide Talk tag, so if anyone is catching the live stream, you can use the hashtag TIETALK, TIETALK, and we will try to bring in your questions during question period. So I don't think I've forgotten anything, so I'll turn over the mic to George, and thank you for coming today.
Well, thank you. Pleasure to be here. Hopefully my audio is coming through all right. If not, I assume somebody will interrupt and let me know. First, I'd like to say thanks to Valerie and Jill for the opportunity to pop in and chat about something that seems to be on the mind of a lot of folks these days, which is MOOCs, or Massive Open Online Courses. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time focusing heavily on the MOOC part of it. I want to talk more about some of the factors around it and what that might mean from an educational sense. You know, what does this mean for the enterprise or the system of education? And it's certainly not clear cut. So I'm not here necessarily to give you some answers and say this is what's happening, this is where we're going. I'm more to say here are some interesting things that are going on globally around higher education. Here are things that you might want to have sort of on your radar and to be aware that they may impact the activity that goes on in a university. So primarily I'm going to look at four distinct areas during the talk. I'm going to start by looking at just broadly what are some changes. And I'll look at the changes staged at several levels. So changes at a global level, the Sociotechnoeconomic changes. Start talking about changes more so in higher education, changes in the Canadian context, and some of the factors that are impacting the individual universities as well. And then after I've sort of looked at that, I'll talk specifically about, what is happening around the MOOC discussion, because you literally can wake up each day and have a changed landscape in MOOCs, and it's one of those buzzword terms that really has gone well past the hype cycle. And so we'll look a little bit at what's happening there, and then for the third part of it, which will be getting a little bit toward the end, these last two elements are a bit compressed, but I'll look at specifically, what's consequential, in all of this MOOC hype and all of this hype that we're hearing about the transformed, the disrupted university, what's actually consequential? Like, which of the trends that are developing that are sort of being deprived of oxygen due to some of the hype terms that are being generated, which of those things do we need to be aware of and pay some attention to? And then finally, I look a little bit at sort of alternative futures scenarios for higher education as a system. So from a big change perspective, the big overview, really, as I mentioned, I'm going to start from the bottom going up to local institutions, and in the process we're going to look at everything from the social, technological, economic dimensions to changed aspects of knowledge, political, legal, and contextual, which is unique in the Canadian context, and then more so from a pedagogical and locally. So what are some of the things happening globally? Well, first of all, higher education is in that dubious position of being, as it's being called, sort of the last major field to disrupt. And or to globalize is another way of putting it. And I don't necessarily mean that as a good thing. So just be aware as I'm sort of sharing some of these observations, I'm not advocating for or against or commenting really on the value aspect of it. We can do that once we get involved in the discussion process later on. But largely speaking, there's been a dramatic increase in the amount of equity that's flowing into educational technology area. And these can either be startups or these can be existing companies that serve the education technology space. Now, the last digital frontier to be fully digitized, or in the words of Rupert Murdoch, it's the last field to be globalized. There's a lot of momentum and activity that some of it involves the traditional publishers that many of you are familiar with, your Pearsons and so on, and then some of the technology companies that have been with us for 12, 15 years now, Blackboard, Desire to Learn, and a lot of the new companies that will start up, which I'll touch on a little bit later on in more detail. But basically, there are a lot of individuals who are very excited about the education space for the intent of its capital generating opportunities. Now, education revenue by some of these major providers is not insignificant, which is why this attention is so substantial. By the way, I should mention, if anybody wants the slides, all of the graphs or the images I share are footnoted. If you go to slideshare.net/G-Siemens, you can download the slides and you can have access to the reports that are referenced on these. But so what's happening essentially then is with companies like Pearson, McGraw-Hill, these are multi-billion-dollar companies that have global perspectives on what they want to see happen in an educational context. And they're impacting virtually every level of education. Now, from a simple step back perspective, in the US in particular, companies like Phoenix and others that were very active in the for-profit landscape sort of got struck by a lightning bolt from a Congress perspective recently with some of their recruiting practices. And so they're in a period of substantial retraction right now in terms of overall enrollment. The smarter companies, namely Pearson, does exactly the same thing that the for-profit vendors did, which is use public funds for developing their business model, but they're doing it sort of under this umbrella of serving the existing model. So they're still extracting the same, if not more, capital out of the education system, out of public funds, but they're doing it without being direct in your face and threatening the university or the school model. So we have then, from an education perspective, a bit of a higher ed arms race where we have delivery platforms that are tuition-based. We've got well over a decade experience in this area. And you have a lot of these emerging MOOC or these free providers that are entering the space virtually overnight. Now, so that's a little bit around the economic structure of higher education. I want to talk a little bit now about the global change patterns in employability and what kind of work individuals are looking for. So this is just a simple, well, maybe simple is not the right word, but this is an image that looks at where have job losses happened in terms of either a gain or an overall loss. And virtually every sector, looking at from 2007 on, had net decreases in job availability, with the exception of education, government, and healthcare. That's what you see on your left-hand side. But as you move over, as higher levels of degrees are achieved by the candidates in that space, employment loss is reduced. So essentially what this communicates from my perspective is that even traditional manufacturing fields have become knowledge fields, which means that if you're in a manufacturing or mining or construction area, the employment loss comes at the physical labor end of the scale, whereas the employment gain comes at the advanced degree level of the scale. And this is reflected in global market shifts in terms of employability, where a greater percentage of the workforce is now focused on what's either called interaction or transaction jobs. So interaction jobs, another word would be creativity-oriented jobs. Transactions would be defined as service-oriented jobs. So essentially the marketplace for production-type work is diminished dramatically in developed countries, but in some of the underdeveloped areas or developing regions, that still comprises or consists of a large part of the overall section of the economy. Now, from the difficulty, though, is so education is more and more important. We need more education than we ever have needed in the past, even if we are in traditional economic sectors. But the drawback is that education is increasingly unattainable for a certain segment of the population. Now, I just want to interject a little bit and say a lot of what you hear about education rhetoric is driven by an American-centric mindset. There are parts of the world where you don't have the same tuition concerns. Let's say Germany, for example, which essentially is free education to the individual learner, but you also have to be aware that in Germany you're not getting the full sports teams package and all the luxury student living accommodations as well. So they have a singular model of teaching and research, whereas North America and increasingly parts of Europe, the model is more about overall social integration and enculturation to a certain community. Anyway, so what this diagram basically just shows is tuition went up a lot since 1960s, and it went up disproportionate to what's happened in other sections of the economy as well. So even since 1980, a dramatic increase, whereas some sectors, let's say the cost of a new car is largely stable from what it was, 94% increase in that timeline, whereas higher education fees have gone up over 1,100% in that period. Now, the other aspect, though, is that in addition to the economy changing and the increased difficulty of getting education or quality education even in developing regions, is that there's an economic shift. Now, probably the best way to describe it is it's a north-south shift and a west-east shift. So capital flow is going to southern regions, Latin America, India, and those areas, Africa, and increasingly going from western countries to eastern countries. And as a result of that, in the US, for example, compared to China, the threshold was really broken for overall enrollment in around 2000, 2002. And since then, it's just an exponential differentiation between the two. And as a secondary aspect of it, the overall increased spending in China in education is enormous, which is perhaps a bit disturbing because a lot of countries are seeing a net decrease in the overall expenditures to the education sectors. Now, the final aspect of this particular point that I want to look at, again, we're looking now at economic, socio-technical factors of change globally. The final one I want to look at is the technical dimension, which is really just that the technologies that we've previously perhaps had access to are now digital or mobile. So the growth of mobile devices is substantial, as many of you are well aware, I'm sure. And even now we're seeing the plateau, the threshold was crossed again in about mid-2001 or so, where we had more mobile lines than landlines, and since that time, I mean, that's grown exponentially. So we're at the stage now where there's more mobile devices in the world than there are people. And so that has a fairly significant impact in how education is delivered, or maybe not even education delivered, but how people access information and how people dialogue. The second aspect then is higher education is what's happening from a knowledge structure end. And what's different about knowledge. And one of probably the one book that, the idea that's impacted me most over the last few years is a text by McNeely and Wolverton called Reinventing Knowledge. And one of the arguments they make in this particular text is that the knowledge institutions of society sort of trace, mirror, map, or follow what's done with information in a particular society. So what we do with information will eventually determine the type of knowledge and the type of learning institutions that we have. And without going to great detail, I assume many of you are familiar with the dramatic tech changes around information. You know, Google Scholar for research rather than sitting in a library rifling through journals. The ability for people to connect with faculty globally through something as simple as Skype or a video internet connection. So what's happened with information, it's much more democratic and much more distributed than what it's been in the past. And as a consequence, the future university model will similarly, hopefully, mirror that distributed nature. One of the interesting texts on this, I think this came out last year, which looked at the half-life of facts, and it looked specifically at the different domains, the different knowledge sectors in society. How long does it take till half of what's known in that field is rendered obsolete? And more, I mean, the fields we're looking at have a diminishing half-life of facts, which means what it takes to track what's happening in your field is increasingly difficult, and we need to specialize. I was at Red River College in the late 90s, and we had a computer guy who would deal with everything you needed with your technology, right? Whether it was you had a problem with an application, you had a problem with your email, you had a problem with your internet connection, there was the computer guy, and it was a guy that you would chat with. And then today, of course, as it got more complex, you had to specialize. So you need your database, you need your security people, you need your network people. And so similarly, when the knowledge domain becomes complex, we have to fragment into smaller specialties, which, as Edgar Morin notes, actually reduces the knowledge capacity of a society because individuals aren't connecting to each other anymore. They're really functioning within their particular space. Now, as a result of this, there's a lot of angst around knowledge and the ability of the university to respond. I assume you've encountered last year where University of Virginia ended up ousting their president because she, as the board believed, the changes that faced education can't be handled at the current model of change. It's got to be exponential change, exponential response to some of the change pressures that they're facing. The world is moving too fast. Now, they rehired her later because of an uproar and this weird thing called due process and things like that. So, but what's happening, though, globally in terms of enrollment, and this is what's interesting. So we've heard a lot of dialogue over the last, definitely the last decade, really gone hyper over the last 5 years, but a lot of dialogue about the university is dying. The university is being replaced. And yet, if you look at enrollment numbers, it's quite the opposite. So, it's a great idea that the university is dying. The only drawback is there's no evidence that supports it. So in this instance here, if you look at globally, and different regions of the world have a more dramatic increase in enrollment. So certainly some of the Asian countries, African countries, even Arab regions of the world are seeing a fairly substantial increase. But if you look at it from a perspective since 2008, we've had overall a 53% increase in the number of students that are involved in higher education, and all indicators at this point suggest that that trend is going to continue in the near term, especially as countries that traditionally haven't had huge participation in education, namely China, India, South Africa, or the African continent as a whole, as well as Latin America. So we're going to see more and more students in higher education in the next decade going forward. The difficulty, though, is that the government is starting to decrease its support of higher education in developing regions of the world. So the public purse contribution to education is being diminished at a fairly substantial rate. It was already declining from 2003, where you sort of, once again, hit that X point where you had the crossover, to no longer is the public supporting the bulk of it, but it's actually individual tuition. And also in 2008, of course, that amplified it dramatically. 2008 was a terrific event. The financial collapse was terrific for people who have an interest in the ed tech space economically, because those companies have shown a dramatic increase in revenue, but it was a very rough cycle for publicly funded systems. Probably University of California system was the worst hit, and of course what happened in UK was equally dramatic in terms of impacting the structure. In a Canadian context, we aren't quite at that same level. The previous stats were US, but we're still seeing a similar pattern. We just haven't crossed the threshold, but the amount that the government supports education versus what individuals pay for tuition is narrowing, and it's not in the favor of the students paying less. Higher education, though, is projected, even with enrollment numbers, to be marginally stable, looking at 6-7% increase, but very significant double-digit increase in online learning, whether that's the K-12 space, higher education, or whether it's looking at corporate learning. So we're going to see, whereas some sectors are seeing 5-6% growth rate, the online learning or e-learning space is experiencing 25 to 30+% growth rates. And in the US alone, for some stats, the Sloan C report that's now run about a decade indicates that the perspectives on this have changed. So in 2002, 10% of total enrollment had online learning representation. Now it's approaching 35% and continuing to grow. Equally important, though, is the recognition that this trajectory is matched with increased confidence on the part of faculty. When they first started running the Sloan C report, faculty would say, online education sucks. It's just not as good, it's not worthwhile. University presidents would say, no, it's not a valid type of learning. Well, that's changed since that time. So suddenly faculty are saying, well, actually, no, online learning can be very effective, and university presidents are saying, yes, online learning can be very effective as well. So the interest is there. So it's not just that the secondary element, MOOCs, I should add briefly, change the societal perception. The research evidence has been strong for well over a decade that suggests it makes no difference, really, in terms of the modality of learning, whether you're learning online or in a classroom, by different metrics, whether you're looking at educational attainment, whether you're looking at competencies, or whether you're looking at grades, there really isn't a difference between online learning and classroom learning. The evidence is clear on that. But what happens is the public perception has been negative about online learning as a cheaper or less effective form of learning. But I think that particular argument was kind of swept under the carpet with the dramatic entrance, if you will, of Stanford, MIT, Harvard, University of Michigan, a combination of private and public colleges and universities entering the online learning space. So that sort of wiped out, I think, what was one of the public perceptions of online learning. Most accusations about the inefficiencies of online learning now are what I would probably describe as religious in nature. I don't believe that's a good way to learn, is more the current response, because the evidence, I think, is fairly clear in that regard. Okay, so now we've talked about the technical, the economic, all those other changes. We've looked briefly at how knowledge as an entity is changing, which requires the university to change and respond. But unfortunately, there are some challenges in terms of what's the shape of the university going to be. Is it going to be an online system? Is it going to be a blended system, and so on? So that's sort of where we are now in our, well, this isn't a discussion. Who am I kidding? So now we're going to talk about the political and the contextual factors that are impacting education in Canada. Education globally is becoming increasingly utilitarian. And so that means it's targeting employment or employability, or if research is being conducted, it's targeting commercialization or some kind of move to market activity. And that was clear in the 2012 federal budget as well, where they basically stated, yeah, this is where we're going to go. We're looking at research for commercial innovation and research for economic growth is a key target. So that's a very substantial research transition in Canada, the Canadian higher education sector. One of the drawbacks, though, in Canada is that not having, I think we probably are the only developed country that doesn't have a federal or a national Department of Education. So everything, we can't necessarily, let's say U.S. Department of Education can allocate a huge chunk of money to a new initiative. We don't have those same opportunities in Canada. And as a result, we don't have a national e-learning, and I'll put in brackets, it's actually more about an innovation, learning innovation strategy. It's not just e-learning. It's also about changing what happens in campus, or changing how we accredit, or changing how we recognize competence. But we don't have that in a Canadian sense, so that means that we have some inability to respond to some of the trends. And the Canadian University, in terms of online education, and this is done by the Canadian Virtual University, or a report that they put out, where they basically argued that, look, we are constrained from development of a national strategy or even a coherent strategy that allows communication across provinces because we don't have the right kind of data and strategic planning. We have an inability to capitalize on what digital technologies can do to improve learning. And as a result of this vacuum, we have weaknesses and a fair degree of duplication that exists system to system. Now, I should mention briefly, I'm not necessarily a huge fan of everything must be optimized to maximum efficiency. I mean, inefficiency is very healthy in a system because that's where you have opportunity for new ideas to emerge, but perpetual inefficiencies aren't good. So we want messiness and we want fuzziness, but if it's something that's perpetually ineffective and making an impact on the system, that does need to be reconsidered. So it's not that I'm arguing we must reduce everything to just the metrics of efficiency. But a key challenge in Canada, though, is we just simply don't have the kind of data that we need to make the decisions that we need to make. So if you just look briefly at the higher education data sources, which are largely disjointed and incomplete, it's hard for university faculty or administrators or even government officials to make the kind of decisions that they need to make because the data sources that we're encountering aren't sufficient enough to provide us with insight into what we need to do. And this is exemplified with MOOCs, for example. I mean, it drives me nuts every time I hear a university globally join Coursera, and or especially in Canada, because every time you join a system, you add value to that system, not necessarily to yourself. And I know there's this, well, all my friends are doing it, so I have to go too factor. But when you think about it, if you partner with an external provider for online or distributed education, what do you export? You export the two most important things that will allow for your future capacity to be successful. One, you export the competency that arises through the development and the management of a distributed system. Secondly, you export your data, which no longer gives you the ability to sufficiently monitor and self-assess where you're going. So I've been on this mindset for a while, but Canada needs a Canadian MOOC response. Fortunately, in the UK, at least, FutureLearn was launched recently on that same kind of an initiative, which was to take a UK perspective on open online courses. So they're building the capacity. Because what's happening right now is, especially with the MOOC providers, Coursera and Udacity out of California, and edX, which is out of Harvard and MIT, what's happening is these are now becoming brilliant hotbeds of innovation and ideas because people are developing the language and the literacy of education because they're programming and working on these. There was a terrific article in the New York Times last couple of days that looked at the impact of research in motion in Waterloo. a lot of and right now Waterloo is listed as one of the most vibrant, innovative technology regions in the world. It's one of the top 10 regions, a small little system. And it's driven exclusively because RIM and the people RIM's investment in the Waterloo University system, RIM's support of people who are developing startups and other companies in that region. So that entire economic ecosystem, that innovation ecosystem, occurred because RIM didn't outsource its activities to different parts of the world. So what's happening is the dollars and the effort that Canadian universities invest in places outside of Canada, they're helping to develop the capacity of those regions for future participation in the online education space. Wine, wine, wine. Now, a final thing that I want to chat about is about sort of more the pedagogical dimensions of what this does for local institutions. So pedagogically, we are at a stage where I think we agree on many levels that some kind of view of education is needed that accounts for the prevalence of social media and network technologies in the daily lives of individuals. And we don't exactly know what that is, but I think we recognize that because of distributed information and because of the distribution of social networks, the ability for individuals to self-organize or for people to organize without organizations, because of those options, there is something about this very central structured model of the university, or learning at least, that needs to be rethought. There's been some initiatives such as the Connected Learning initiative that emphasizes the development of pedagogical models that are distributed, that involve people from different geographical regions, different levels of expertise, that emphasize peer culture, that emphasize something where you're generating things. You're not just consuming the ideas that others have, but you're creating something. You're making something as part of the learning process. And that's reflected as well in participatory pedagogical models too, where we're saying, you know what, maybe we don't need to fully optimize the curriculum so that all students have to do is jump through our hoops or click the right buttons. Maybe we want to bring students into that experience so that they're creating parts of the curriculum. There are spaces in the curriculum that allow students to create their own identities and to let themselves be known in that experience. Okay, so I move on to what's happening with MOOCs. That's a very rapid run through changes. So because I'm trying to emphasize, in terms of higher education, the change structures, the change drivers are on many levels. Everything from the pedagogical practices that happen in a classroom to the devices and the technologies that students use for teaching and learning, that faculty use, as well as the economic commitment from governments to public education. There's a raft of changes that need to be considered and that the university is starting to absorb and will have to continue to absorb in the foreseeable future. Let's talk MOOCs. So MOOCs are, I can comfortably say I've never seen a trend in higher education that developed as rapidly as the MOOC conversation did. I've also never seen a change or a trend in higher education that became as prominent as quickly with zero faculty input. I'm not aware of one university system, and I've chatted with many that are involved in the MOOC space. Not a single system came through the faculty senate or through the faculty model. Everyone came out of the IT end of the house or from a VPA sort of saying, this is what we're going to do, it's going to be experimental. Faculty essentially have not had a say in this. And on one level, I would say, I think there's a substantial issue there, but on the one level, I would also say faculty are partly responsible for not being more aware of the trends that are developing. I mean, we can't just say, these are bad people who are trying to change education. My first response is, well, where are the good people that are supposed to prevent it? Anyway, so what's happening with MOOCs? First of all, there's a variety of MOOC providers. So first, there's the big three. So the big three are your Udacity, Coursera, and edX. Coursera and Udacity are both for-profit MOOC players. edX, in contrast, is not. They are, because they're Harvard, MIT, it's also the best funded. And I will say comfortably, if you've taken courses in all three, the edX platform is light years ahead of what others are doing. They've put a lot of effort into what they're doing, but their goal also is they're creating public resources. They want their MOOC platform is open. There's boutique MOOCs. I don't know what else to call these. There's the XMOOC and CMOOC distinction. But boutique MOOCs are these, it's kind of like you go to this place because you want something small and specific, right? You're not going to Walmart. So the boutique MOOCs are, depending on who you talk to, systems where you might have 200 or 500 or 600 participants involved. I would add DS 106 for those of you that are involved to that, but they're adamant that they're not a MOOC. The another one that's starting to develop as a player, though, is the content providers. And the content providers are Pearson and McGraw-Hill. They're not going to sit idly by and allow systems like Udacity and Coursera to diminish the content platform of the learning process. So they are starting to become prevalent in the MOOC space, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later with what they're doing. And the LMS providers shouldn't be forgotten either, because they're present on many campuses, and as a result of that, they're offering MOOC-like initiatives. So Desire to Learn being one, and Canvas and Structure being another as well. So what do people think about MOOCs? Well, that varies. So you have some folks that would say that MOOCs will take out the trash of the university system. And this is a famed MIT physics professor who stated, you know what, this is a US number, but 10,000 colleges, when you get down to the bottom, they really suck. And in the next decade, those will be taken out. Literally, he does use the word, that's the trash that will be eviscerated or removed by the university system. But there's some who are saying, well, MOOCs, we need to think about this a little bit differently. There's actually something else going on in education that is more complex than just moving content online. And so there's an initiative coming out of, Newton is, if you haven't heard of that organization, I would say out of all the ed tech companies I've seen, that's the one that has Google-like potential in terms of its impact in the education market going forward. But so basically what Newton has done is they're an adaptive learning platform. If you spend 3 hours in Newton in an afternoon, they'll collect 150,000 data points on you. And they'll use those data points to determine what kind of content you'll receive, how fast you'll receive that content. If you log in at 8 in the morning and you're used to logging in at 2 in the afternoon, they'll build an 8 a.m. profile for you because you might be a little more dense at 8 a.m. than you are at 2 in the afternoon. So it's a very advanced view of what the learning process is like. 30 people, 30 different courses. Newton has partnered with Pearson. Pearson's actually a significant shareholder in Newton, I might add, but with Arizona State University, where they're starting to emphasize the creation of an alternative ecosystem for how people actually learn, so that the inefficiencies of today's education system, let's face it, all of you came in here and you all had different views of or knowledge about MOOCs. Some of you are very familiar with what a MOOC is and what these systems are like. Some of you might have heard of it, but haven't really thought about it much. But essentially, you all get the same message from me. The point with this Newton and Pearson and ASU initiative is that you will get what exists in gaps. Like the gaps that you have is what you will get from a learning perspective. Now, you might have also heard this last week. There's such joyful irony here, but a course called The Fundamentals of Online Education through Coursera was canceled because of student revolt, because it wasn't a well-designed course. So there are challenges of it, but it's also worth emphasizing that there are, I believe, the number is around 6,000 MOOCs, and to have one bomb spectacularly, that's not a bad average. If we could hit those averages with our in-classroom classes, that would probably be pretty good. The only problem, though, with the views here, and these views are quite dichotomous, right? What are MOOCs going to do and what won't they do? So on the one hand, there's an initiative or a group of individuals that say, this is going to fundamentally de-skill the professorate. There will be thousands, tens of thousands of professors' jobs that will be eliminated, because if what we do in our classrooms is basically lecturing, then record it once, make it a brilliant piece of content, and then distribute it online. Then you have the development of organizations such as Saylor is doing this. Saylor is a major player in the open education movement, and they're starting to work with other colleges for the development of learning that happens wherever, but it gets accredited with specific universities. So you can take a Saylor course, but you can take an inexpensive exam, in this case a $90 exam. So self-regulated, self-guided learning. It's not the Coursera model, which has a set start and stop time. The Saylor resources are freely available at any time. Now, another one as well, which is interesting, and I'll touch on this I've got a couple slides and I'll get back to this, but it's the initiative now that University of Wisconsin has started, which is that they really don't care where you do your learning. They're just going to do the assessment for it. And so you can get a bachelor's degree without taking any courses through University of Wisconsin. And University of Wisconsin is a reputable system. So this isn't like it's some fly-by-night operation that just showed up last week and is now offering degrees. So that's something to think about. And I think it's worth emphasizing that they call it the flexible degree options. There's a variety of models that people can adopt, but it still has the prospect of really causing students to think differently about what is it that I expect from a university. And then you have systems like edX, for example, that are working with systems to try and improve, or working with community colleges to do a better job of preparing individuals for employment. So they're saying, some of these community colleges, the trash that sits in the bottom % of the overall higher education market in the US, they're working with those systems to improve the quality of instruction so that those systems can focus on different activities such as learner support. So on some level, they essentially become the conduits for the big names. Perhaps in a similar way that today universities are conduits for the textbook providers, where students get the textbooks. We don't all write our own textbooks, and students get access to the big names or the big thinkers in that field. And that's what might happen with community colleges as well, is you do your learning through, or you take your course content through the big profs out of Harvard and MIT, and you're there more to arrange the deck chairs on the assessment scale. Okay, so what's really important? And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on these elements, but I want to touch on these, and some of these you'll have various levels of familiarity with it. But what's actually happening that is substantial, that's significant? I think there's certain things about MOOCs that can be very significant, but right now the hype is far overblown for what the evidence indicates. And the quality of learning in most MOOCs today is not very advanced. In fact, if anything, Skinner would love MOOCs. I mean, this is like a return to the glory days of lecturing and drilling student knowledge. So don't care what's happening in learners' head, we just want the results. Okay, so what's significant? I'm going to put a list of 6 resources that I think are very substantial in terms of what their impact will be on higher education. First of all, a big area, and I'll cover a couple of these points off in subsequent slides, but a big area is the growth of the non-traditional learner market. Okay, the learner base is diversifying. And so one of the things that we can likely expect is that a good portion of learners in higher education going forward are going to fit that non-traditional profile, which will similarly drive interest in online learning. Competency-based learning, that I think is, some initiatives are like Western Governors University, and if you are an elitist academic, you might not like the word competence. So use whatever word you want to use that is more fragmented than a course. But essentially, we're moving in the education sector going forward from course models to competency models. And the reason is because the more granular you get, the more focused your instruction and learning activities can be for learners. And competency also ties directly to the next point, which is personalization and adaptation. The fourth point is the prevalence of data and analytics. The more we make I bored them, they left. Anyway, the more you make your learning explicit, the more it's available to be analyzed by some system somewhere. I mentioned that there's 1,000 data points being captured by Newton an afternoon of learning. And the University of Rio Salado College, not university, out of Arizona, they can predict by their system, day 8, within a 70% accuracy rate, whether you're going to pass or fail that course, just based on your behavioral patterns early on. Now again, analytics risk the exact same thing happening with MOOCs, which is a return to very behaviorist views of learning. The fifth aspect is the development of alternative assessment models, challenge exams, badges, prior learning assessment, and so on. And then finally, the sixth point, I won't dive into this one much because I know you recently had John Walensky, I think, came in to talk about open education, so I assume that you have a passing familiarity with that. But that's another area that's going to have a dramatic impact on the university going forward. Now let me just backtrack a little bit and highlight a few things. First of all, the increasing diversity of student profiles. Tony Bates recently posted on this. This is an article that the U.S. government actually posted on what's happening in terms of employment of students in education. Now, it only makes sense that more students are working while they're getting an education when you finish racking up tuition costs by 1,100%. So I guess it makes sense that more of them have to work. But the interesting commentary from Tony Bates was that the U.S. is in a position now where they actually, full-time students are in the minority in the university sector. The various profiles of students, namely part-time or whatever else, online, blended, are the majority now. So that's a dramatic trend, because if your student profiles change, then your offerings have to change as well. And that's part of the reason that drives the University of Wisconsin Flex Degree Initiative, part of what drives attention to online education as a whole, or blended learning, which allows people to squeeze these things sort of into the daily process of their lives. Second aspect too that I just want to touch on from those previous 6 points is the growing proliferation of analytics. And whether you're looking at the quantified self, which is just a movement where you track your own activity. If you go to the quantified self website, there's a variety of tools, the hardware you can purchase. Google Glasses, for example, fits very much into that as well, which eventually is supposed to hit the public marketplace. And anything from your running habits, but just tracking your diet and those kinds of things. So it's really about self-awareness through analytics. Unfortunately, in education, that's been very underdeployed. I think it would be great if students could see exactly what the university sees about them in terms of data, where they're positioned in relation to other students in the program, where they're positioned based on what students have done in the past. So there's a variety of aspects around analytics that can be considered. Okay, so now I'm going to make a transition. I want to talk now about what I said I was going to talk about in the title for the last 5 minutes. So one of the things that's happening broadly in the education sector, and not just broadly, but on many distinct levels, is this experience of fragmentation, right? So our content is fragmented. We get, and I noticed this several years ago in just Moodle forums, when I was teaching, is that in the past, students, I would say, okay, this is the article or the series of articles this week. And then students would be in Moodle talking about those articles. But about 3-4 years ago, all of a sudden that kind of changed. And all of a sudden now it was, they wouldn't just read the articles, but they spent as much time sharing other articles rather than just consuming what I had posted. So suddenly you had a whack of links to TED Talks, and you had open education resources being linked in, or you had pop psychology authors being linked into those discussion forums. That was a big change. It basically altered this notion of students as consumers to students starting to become more active pedagogically. So that's what I want to look at now. So on that level, there's a fragmentation of knowledge in the learning experience, but there's also a fragmentation of functionality in the university. Instead of the university being an integrated ecosystem, the university is becoming something that looks much more like a fragmented system, which is continuing to be fragmented at a rapid pace with the development of new startups. So let's say you have in the past had research, you had teaching, you had assessment, all under one roof, the roof of the university. Well, now, especially with the rise of MOOC providers and a variety of other players in the space, you now have content being produced and created somewhere else that you learn, and you're just being assessed by the university. Or you have, and there's been a few announcements actually just this morning about ACE and Coursera announcing a partnership where 5 courses from Coursera are going to be recognized as credit. So what you're seeing is teaching is being split out or fragmented from the assessment model as well. So that's that fragmentary nature of education, both in terms of knowledge coherence and in terms of how we function as a university. First, I want to talk about knowledge coherence. This is a big issue because if I'm involved in one classroom and one interaction with a faculty member, then the faculty member has laid out or thought through that knowledge domain, hopefully. And so as a result of being aware of that knowledge domain, they communicate that to you in a way that's reasonably coherent. And so when you begin to fragment information access, you naturally create gaps in knowledge, which means that if somebody said, oh, I listened to a TED Talk, and oh, I read a Jeff Jarvis article, and oh, I was over here doing this, chances are they will have picked up some misconceptions along the way, and those misconceptions need to be corrected. And in particular, those ideas, how do those ideas relate and fit together? This is the issue of education. That generation of a coherent, thoughtful worldview is vital. when you do it in bits and pieces, you risk developing a contradictory system of knowledge. So basically, coherence is an orientation related to meaning and the value of information so that students can understand how they're connected and why they're connected in the particular way that they are. And this is a reality because even in complex system, you have these agents or these individuals that only possess part of the knowledge. It's certainly more so the case. I mean, I think it's unlikely we're going to generate in our generation another Einstein because complex knowledge requires teams, not individuals. And so we need to find ways to connect individuals or experts to try and flesh out a complete or a more broad understanding of a domain. And this is a function of really, knowledge in pieces. There's bits and pieces, and if we want to gain a complex understanding, the biggest task is to connect people to one another. Or put another way, knowledge development and learning process should really be concerned about understanding relationships, not just memorizing the facts. The facts are important, so I'm not advocating for a diminishment of facts, but naming things, or put another way, naming nodes, is a low-level knowledge task. Understanding connectivity between those things is a much higher knowledge task. Just give you a very simple example. If you spend your day reading news reports and results on what's happening in higher education, you're going to come across blended learning and online learning and MOOCs, and you're going to come across these systems and those systems, and University of Wisconsin's doing that. Those are all what I would call naming nodes. That's points of information that, until you sit down and you think, how do they fit? What's the impact of that? What will the impact be of open online courses on universities or knowledge in society in general? So once you sit down and you start understanding the structural relationships and the influence of altering one aspect of that on the overall network as a whole, until you start doing that, you're really functioning at low-level knowledge activities. And so, as I've already talked about, when content sits in this fragmented place, the knowledge that students are involved in is generative, but the coherence, though, is exclusively learner-guided. Now, contrary to some folks in the Web 2.0 world, I'm a firm believer in expertise because there's significant evidence on probably the best book on this is the Cambridge Handbook of Experts and Expertise, which looks at the cognitive thinking structures, or the cognitive patterns of experts is fundamentally different from the thinking patterns of people who are new to a space. Experts think in the work of Klein, where he looks at sources of power, his particular text, he emphasized that experts think in patterns, whereas novices think sequentially or in steps. Which is, why an expert, in the example that Gary Klein used in his text, is an expert walks into a situation such as a firefighter and can immediately sense when things aren't quite right and act intuitive. Malcolm Gladwell mistakenly calls that sort of this blink concept, right, where it's just intuitive, whereas the reality is just a sign of deep expertise in a domain. Anyways, and then more and more with these spaces and interactions, like I've already mentioned, being multifaceted, we need to create a context where learners can express their creativity, their sort of the autonomous aspects of the learning process, self-regulation, peer regulation, but there still is a value for the expert to be involved in that discussion. I'm going to flip past these next slides quickly because, well, I'm getting bored. Okay, so what's our future? Probably the best way to describe what our future is to take some time and to think about what should a university be. Right, so I'm going to go through a couple of quick slides, and I'll say once MOOCs address these challenges, then I think MOOCs will be substantial. I don't think they'll get to this point, though, in the near future, unless there's a dramatic shift in the technologies around socialization and group forming. So I think Carl Breider and Marlene Scardmillan and Carl Breider stated it well when they said, a big part of the education process is to enculturate youth into a knowledge-creating civilization and to help them find their place in it. Or, put another way, it's about the social and academic connection of the university. And there's some work that, Saracen, for example, has written about psychological sense of community, the sense of acknowledged interdependence in our learning process. Or, again, looking at Boyer and Tinto's work, it's the social and academic connection to a knowledge space, which we call a university. Or probably the best illustration of this, and I'm going to call this my Will MOOCs Replace Higher Education test. And I'll go to Harvard. So Harvard has a statement that they updated in about 2006. It's their some universities have what they call sort of principles of graduatedness or something like that. So Harvard has a 4-point principle. They say this is what a student graduating from Harvard will be able to do. So this is the MOOC test. Can it prepare students for civic engagement? Can it help students understand themselves as products of and participants in the traditions of art, ideas, and values? Can it help students to respond critically, creatively, constructively to change? And finally, can it help students to recognize and be aware of the ethical dimensions to what they do or in terms of what they say? So this is really the sense of there's more that happens in a university than just consuming information. There's more that happens in a university than being able to follow through someone's tutorial that they've created. Last couple slides. So how does this trend differ from others? Why is it that I'm at least saying that higher education, I know all of you have probably had the argument, we heard this when they were going to bring television into classrooms back in the 70s, back in the 80s, or we heard this with radio instructions in the 50s. What is it that's different, or at least that I'm arguing, that is different about MOOCs or MOOC-related or online learning or this constellation of change drivers that I addressed early on, economic and technical and so on? What's different this time? The biggest thing is that it is a sociotechnoeconomic change, and Carlotta Perez has written about this extensively, about dramatic changes in society are a function of activity within each of those three spaces. So when we brought TVs, for example, into a classroom, we didn't pretend to start messing around with accreditation. We didn't pretend to start messing around with new approaches for people to interact with one another globally, right? It was basically, we were saying, we'll teach with television. So today, because of the change pressures economically and the development of technology, that is a dramatically different context. And again, I encourage you to look at the work of Carlotta Perez around dramatic change cycles historically. She traces it through the big trends like the Industrial Revolution and those kinds of patterns that really had an impact that altered society, is a criteria of these three components. Secondly, there is fragmentation happening in higher education now. When we wheeled a television into a lecture hall, nobody was pretending that higher education was now going to fragment, and teaching and learning and research and assessment were going to be distinct functions within the university enterprise. And secondly, what's happening right now, and this should be on the radar of every academic, is that there is a parallel ecosystem being created, an integrated ecosystem where the providers of next generation tools and technologies are connecting with one another to create sort of a significant or a substantive force. I'm going to briefly go all conspiracy theory on you. edX, Coursera, and Udacity are the three big MOOC providers. edX is the most innovative, the best technology, the best funded, the two most elite universities in the world. They receive minimal airplay in the media sector. So here's my conspiracy. Because they are in the service of the public good and they aren't part of this overall for-profit activity that goes on with Coursera and Udacity, which in turn aren't tied to the board execs and the newspapers and other resources that help to pump up that kind of activity and momentum, they're more peripherally involved in the discussion around MOOCs. Now, I know I'm saying that tongue-in-cheek, but I do think it's an interesting question to ask. Why is it that some of the activity around MOOCs is so selective in coverage? And my argument is those systems that have a for-profit motive are connected to others who also have a for-profit motive, and they create a self-enforcing ecosystem. Conspiracy theory over. Now, final point. What are some future scenarios for the university going forward? Well, I don't think we can think of it. I mean, if anybody says they know what's happening with universities, then they fundamentally misunderstand complexity theory. So complexity theory essentially is the view that when you have different entities in play and they don't have a solidified relationship with one another, you cannot necessarily predict how those things will form and reform in the future. It's only stability or a period of stability that will allow you to begin to effectively predict next steps. I think there's too much in play right now to really say this is the future of higher education. So that's why I'm going to emphasize a variety of potential options. One is status quo. This MOOC stage kind of keeps going, but it'll go away eventually, and it'll be done. And then we'll all go back to where we were, where we don't have to worry about our jobs anymore, and we don't have to hear silly acronyms at all of our faculty meetings. The second option is that universities essentially become accrediting agencies. This notion of teach globally, accredit locally, right? Where you can take your course MOOCs wherever you want. We'll give you recognition for it. Maybe we'll do a bit of gap filling, the way that Western Governors University does with their platform. But by and large, we're going to be here to give you that stamp. You trust the UVic, you trust the UBC, you trust the TRU name. That's what we're going to do for you. Another one, which I think is a real probability because it's already unfolding and technically is tied to the point I just mentioned about accrediting, is unbundling. Where teaching and research and other activities are separated, and we resume a model that was sort of pre-German university model of integrated systems. So we may end up with research labs that don't do anything around teaching, and essentially have a variety of teaching systems or colleges that emphasize that. Another aspect that's quite probable is localization and specialization. There are certain knowledge domains that, let's say, universities in BC have that a university, let's say, in Alberta won't have. You'll have access to knowledge domains. So let's say UBC or University of Alberta, we have one of the premier paleontology research spaces in the world. And that's something that somebody in a different part of the world might not have access to. So U of A becomes that particular specialized area of knowledge. The only problem is they become a prominent node. They become the Google of the paleontology space. And that's one of the things, the impact is globalization creates a few very large winners and many conduits. The transformed university, this is where the university says, oh yeah, you know what? This technology thing that the kids are using is really cool. We need to get on board with it and start offering online courses or blended courses. And certainly this lab here is an example of a distributed medical training or distributed medical teaching area is an illustration of that, where a university says, okay, we've got to rethink our pedagogical model and try something different or try something that's much more reflective of learners' needs. And part of that equation is obviously emphasizing the use of competency-based learning, where learning moves from courses to competencies or something like that. The final point that might arise is the university as an integrated ecosystem or a new emerging ecosystem. If the best way, and I'm quite confident that we are in the last cycle of LMS adoptions or LMS replacements. So I think we're getting to the stage now where we're going to stay with the LMS providers we have long term. And the reason I say that is because what LMS providers are starting to do now is they're starting to add analytics to the LMS as a device, which means those analytics are tied to student information systems, which means they're tied to institutional decision making. It's like we're going to see people changing LMSs about as often as we see people leaving SAP, for example. And they don't leave SAP very often because it's $1 billion experience for a large company to leave. So my argument is similar. As the LMS and the analytics for an LMS become more prominent, they become integrated to the university system. It's the same competition that Pearson's providing against the open source movement. Pearson's response to open education is not to continue sort of emphasizing the quality of their content. No, Pearson's response has been, we're going to add personalized adaptive learning, namely the affiliation with Newton. So yeah, have all of your free education out there that you want, but we're going to make it personal for you, and it's going to be more effective, reduced degree completion time. And if you're sitting across the vice president making a financial decision, guess who wins out? A few quick points. Just emphasize we have a conference in Calgary. This is a brief moment of PR, May 1st to 3rd on EdTech innovation. And I think we have time for questions now.
All right. Well, thank you very much for everyone for tuning in, and apologies to TRU. I guess you lost the feed for a couple of minutes there. But perhaps we can welcome questions from each site. We can maybe take some turn takings. If people do have to go at 12 o'clock, we won't find it rude if you have to get up and leave. So maybe we'll start with the local site, UVic. If anyone has a question and would like to give it to George, you have a mic in front. You just need to click the button. If you have a solid red light, then you're live. Depress it when you're done, and if you have a flashing red one, you're queued. So I'll release mine and see if anyone else would like to ask a question. The camera will turn on you when you press the button. All right, I think we're all too shy here. I'll also turn to maybe Jill can check Thai Talk, the hashtag for some questions. I know we had one there that I favorited. Perhaps we can turn to TRU next. And if you can open your mic up there, you're welcome to fire off your questions for George.
Hi, this is Gail Marang at TRU. I'd like a comment about the phrase in MOOCs that means open. So I agree the MOOCs are massive. I agree they are online. I have a problem with the O, which is supposed to be open, but a lot of them are not open in the way I thought open was supposed to mean. We're sharing it, you can take it, use it, adapt it. You know, that definition of open that I'm used to. Could you comment about that? Oh, it MOOCs me.
You know, that is such an antiquated definition of openness as far as edtech startups are concerned. No, that's a very good point, and there are some. I mean, Udacity, I believe they specifically license material, Creative Commons licensed as well. So there is that aspect that's worth looking at. So, but you're right. I mean, what we mean by openness in terms of, and this goes right back to, Richard Stallman conversations, right? You know, do we mean open as in can you just access it and use it, but you can't create it, improve it, those sort of freedoms that you expect around software? That's the same issue that we face around MOOCs. You know, can you take a Coursera course, take the piece that you want, remix it, add it to your curriculum and use it? Is it that kind of open? And no, it's not. It isn't that kind of open. So they right now equate openness not with the capacity for recreation, but they look at openness as being more about can you access it without fees. So they have a financial definition of openness, not an ideological or more of a broad reuse definition of openness. So it's a good question and a good point.
Oh, do I have? I have a red button here that's on. I was just wondering. I was going to ask, what implications do you think are there for those of us who are involved in mentoring, teaching, coaching people entering into higher education teaching?
Well, I mean, it's difficult. I mean, on the one hand, and this is really the intent of education anyways, it needs to prepare people for the society that they're going to enter, especially once they graduate from a university program. And I think a lot of universities aren't preparing people certainly for the technological dimension of work settings.
Right.
So I think that's, but in terms of what advice, I think probably the best thing is, you really can't teach what you haven't experienced or what you aren't familiar with. And I'm often surprised at the strong response about how poor MOOCs are from people who've never taken a MOOC, right? So I mean, I think that's one dimension to think about as well, is that, not taking a MOOC, commenting extensively on it would be classified as bad research. So I would encourage, faculty to get into the space of interacting with technology, whether it's just, just use the toys that all those cool kids use. I mean, I used to sign up for probably about 5 new technologies a day back when, when Web 2.0 was just starting. Now I try and keep it down to, a couple a week or a couple a month, that are trending. So, Reddit, for example, I ignored Reddit for a long time, but about a year ago, maybe 8 months ago, I was fascinated by the social movement dimension of Reddit. So I'd ignored it long enough and ended up diving in. Last week or about a week and a half ago, Twitter initiated Vine, this sort of short video recording thing. At this stage, I have zero interest in Vine. I might in the future get a little more involved. So if you're looking at just saying I want an overview of what's happening with technology, best thing I can suggest is find the prominent tools and then experiment with them. And not just experiment with them like sit in isolation and click on it and say, oh, I don't know what the point of this is, but join these social spaces where these technologies are being used to get the real value of it. Otherwise, from a mentorship perspective, the biggest thing obviously is helping students to think critically, right? So it's recognizing that, just because you tweet does not make you an academic. And so there are different dimensions around critical thinking, sort of those 4 principles that that Harvard listed as part of undergraduate education. But anyway, we could go a long time on this theme because there's many dimensions that are technically in terms of personal skills and competence, but also in terms of the impact of students. Part of education isn't to be transformed by technology, but is to thoughtfully and critically be aware of the implications of trends and to use that awareness in a university context to thoughtfully transform society or the students that come through.
Oh, okay, I think I'm on. George, thanks for that. That was really fantastic. The first 45 minutes especially, it was one of the best overviews I think I've heard of the disruptions that we're experiencing. And in a way,
my relationship with Scott
Yeah.
knows that this needs to be marked somewhere.
Yeah, and it's a shame in a way that it takes so long to get that out, because it's the last part that I think is the really interesting part, is like, how are we going to adapt and change to these things? One of the things I was interested to hear you not talk about more in terms of disruptions was, there's clearly these disruptors in terms of content deliverers and accessibility. But the lock-in we still seem to have is around the accreditation piece, right? But the disruption there that I'm seeing on the horizon is badges. And right now people are looking at this as like kind of a, and I think the name really does it a disservice. They hear badges, they hear Boy Scout badges. But I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the potential for that for disruption, whether it's real or is that just a technological utopian idea?
Well, thanks for your comments, Scott. First of all, I'll just start by saying I haven't thought enough about badges to be able to give you as nuanced a reply as that question deserves. So be aware that from that as a background. But I'll talk briefly about what is it that badges or degrees or anything else really does. So way back when I was just a boy in the 1400s. The university, what gave credit to someone was, who are you affiliated with? Like, it wasn't this artificial paper that says George knows this, but if somebody says, okay, George studied with Scott, and Scott we know is well established in this field, so by default, Scott wouldn't put up with a bunch of nonsense. So if George says he studied with him, he knows what he's doing. And that was the mediator of competence. Now, what happens is when systems become larger and more diverse, and suddenly you don't know everyone anymore, then the mediator of competence has to be systematized. Like, you can socialize a mediation of competence if it's with people that you know well. That's why people online who are terrific programmers might have no programming experience, but their social network knows this guy or this lady, this person can program. If that's the stance that they take, then that works just fine. But so the key emphasis here is when you can no longer socially mediate competence, you have to systemically mediate competence. And that systemic mediation of competence right now is a university degree, right? So we can say, I have no idea what you're capable of, but I know you went to University of Victoria, and it's accredited, so now I trust that you can do that. But it's kind of like value, right? The only time something has value is when we all agree that it does, right? So it's kind of like I don't know, this might not work, but in my head, this is what I'm thinking right now. It's like the Paris Hilton effect of value, right? There was a time where Paris Hilton was very sought after for public appearance clubs, bars, and those kinds of things, because for some reason, we all agreed that she was cool. Right now, apparently, it's Kim Kardashian. Now, anyway, that's off topic. So we know it's not a great metric, but it's a metric that relies on the collective masses being able to assign or agree that, yes, this is important. Paris Hilton is important. The same thing holds true with the university degree. As long as we can say, yes, you got a degree from this university, I'll trust that. Even though I know that you're going to learn a bunch of stuff and you might drink more beverages while at university than you will at any point in the rest of your life. But, you've got a degree. The same holds true with badges, where once we collectively decide that I trust those badges, then it becomes a systemic mediating role for determining competence. And the moment that happens, it doesn't matter whether it's a badge or it doesn't matter whether it's a degree from, wherever. The point is that we trust that as a source, or that we validate that and we come to an agreement on it. So I agree with you from an assessment end and accreditation end, which I didn't spend much time on. Badges or something like that, it has huge prospect in education.
Hello, thank you. So what do you think about the integration of MOOCs into high schools, which are unable to facilitate AP courses, yet have students that would want or are interested in taking these courses? Is it possible, and can it be effective?
Well, I guess the criteria of effectiveness is probably important there, because what's effective from a government end is likely going to be different than what's effective for a teaching end or what's going to be effective for a student end. But so broadly speaking, yes, I think it's possible. I would ask systems that do that to think carefully about what are they losing in that process, right? So on the one hand, if you don't have access to certain kinds of content matter or subject experts or instructors, I mean, I personally, I'd like to be negative on the big MOOCs, because I think there's something happening there that I'm not comfortable with in terms of de-skilling the professorate and reducing the education process to a sequential experience. But I've also chatted with folks in India, in China, in South Africa, in Latin America, and for them, they love the MOOC experience. It creates self-confidence in them, it gives them a sense of being connected, it generates a level of knowledgeability that they wouldn't have locally. So my first response is, I really can't intervene on someone else's learning and say, no, that's nonsense, don't learn that way, don't get smart that way. So first of all, that's a bit of a background, but in areas such as Canada, US, or Europe, where we have the luxury of being able to think ideologically about things because we aren't confronted with the same, do I have electricity today or not? We can sort of aggregate up our level of reflection. Then I think we do need to ask questions about, is this good for the student? Is it good for the system? Is it good for the structure of education? Definitely some foundations, Gates Foundations and other in the US, are looking at the high school MOOC experience. Some of the activity that Udacity is involved in, they've reached out and connected with high school systems as well to sort of bring them and prepare them for university education. So yeah, I would say absolutely you can make an impact with that kind of a MOOC format. The question that we need to ask ourselves in the education space is, because something is possible, is it desirable? Should we do it? Or are there a range of options that might be more difficult to do but are actually more important for long-term sustainability of the public education model?
Thank you.
And that brings us back to me. I know we didn't actually set an end time, but I think it would be great if we can catch one more question from Twitter, and then to see if TRU has anything to add. So I do have a question from Peter on the TITalk hashtag. Can you describe the focus of the analytics, learner focus or institutional focus, or both or other? Could you answer that for us?
Sure. Well, first of all, this is another infomercial. There's actually, if you go to canvas.net, we start a course on Monday. It's an 8-week open course on learning analytics for anyone that's interested. But the focus is, it varies, right? So some systems are using analytics for systemic improvements. I would look at that more as being business intelligence, right? It's really about improving the functioning of the university. And I've been at conferences where someone says, we're doing learning analytics. We have started to analyze classroom use space, and we reschedule our classroom use differently now so that all of our classrooms are full, which means we can get more courses, and that's learning analytics. And I'd say, no, that's not learning analytics, because there's no learning involved there, right? That's business intelligence, or that's organizational analytics. So that's definitely possible. When I look at learning analytics, I would look at things such as, does it give the learner better insight into her study habits and skills? Does it provide her with a deeper understanding of how she's socially connected to others in a classroom? And is it desirable that she's connected that way? Right? If you just look at folks who are active in social media, most people in social media do some level of self-analysis. It might be for ego purposes, but you do some level of, who am I connecting with, who's replying to me. So you're involved in explicitly sort of making sense of how you're connecting with others. A new Twitter analysis tool comes along, or a Facebook graph tool comes along, and you can gain some insight through self-analysis. So I think that's an important aspect with analytics. The other aspect is, does it allow the university to help you do better as a student? So those are analytics that could be, real-time feedback to teachers. What are you doing in terms of, are you losing students in interest? Have you moved through a subject area too quick where students didn't grasp or understand what you wanted them to understand, and so on? So there's a variety of factors that can play into the learning analytics discussion, but definitely analytics are being used at an enterprise level as well, but I wouldn't quite call that learning analytics person.
Great, thank you. I'll release the mic, and Brian Lamb up at TRU, if you would like to have one last question, if we can wrap up in 2 minutes, that would be great.
You kind of moaned the lack of a national strategy in terms of online learning and some of the recent developments we've seen. Given that, if you're an institution, and let's assume that you have something like an online learning capacity already, what are some of the kind of simple pragmatic steps that an institution can do on its own in the absence of a national strategy to kind of respond to the kind of trends that you were indicating in your talk?
Well, that's a great question, and one that actually requires another couple hours of us discussing it. But I'd say, there's so many places that I guess a system could begin. I think one of the biggest ones is I would like to see Canadian universities or Canadian systems be a little bit less territorial and recognizing that you get more when you kind of collaborate and work together. So I'd love to see a Canadian version of Coursera or a Canadian version of Future Learn or something like that that allows us to build our capacity together. But at the specific institution level, so I'm with Athabasca University, and we're an online system, and so we have a lot of activity around the design process. So we spend time looking at, how can you better improve your pedagogical model, how can you use data to understand what's happening with students, and those kinds of activities. But what I find interesting now is what's happening with the learning design space, let's say like Coursera or Udacity is doing. I think Udacity has a learning design model that is very significant for higher education. And it, even though right now people say, well, it's not as good as a university experience, but the way they're experimenting, the way they're iterating. For example, if you develop a learning module with Coursera or Udacity, I should say, you'll get feedback literally within a span of 24 hours. They have a series of beta testers that will review your content for accuracy, understandability, and so on. And you'll get, basically real-time peer review feedback. So everything that hits the Udacity site has been peer-reviewed and has been, looked at by many different eyeballs. So from a design end, we take, I'll give two illustrations, well, one. So I started a certificate in data analytics at Athabasca University, and this conversation I started about 2 years ago. Year and a half ago, just over a year ago, I guess, it was approved internally to move forward. So now it's been pinging around university meetings and councils and discussions, and I think at this stage it's now waiting for government approval to start offering that certificate program. I think that's nuts. I mean, in a world where knowledge is changing rapidly, in a world where knowledge is changing rapidly and it takes you 2 years to get a course up or a program up, there's something flawed. So when you get a system like Udacity that can take a course and have it available in a month, from idea to teaching in a month, that should be kind of the model that universities should look at. So, Brian, getting back to that's something I would definitely, say a rapid process for developing curriculum so you can start offering relevant teaching areas. So instead of thinking we develop a master's that runs for 20 years, maybe we think we develop certificates or programs that run for 3 years, and then we know the field will change, and then we've got to continue to be developing. Other ends, getting, I think, faculty connected. I mean, I know you're very active online as well, Brian, and through development of Twitter networks and your activity blogging and otherwise. But I think that's an experience that from a capacity development and universities need to do as well, is namely get their staff involved in these kinds of spaces where they can start to connect with others and experience what it means to be networked in terms of your ability to do complex knowledge tasks rather than trying to think you have to figure it out on your own. And finally, I could go on forever on this, but I'll just make a final point on that, is that recognizing that uncertainty and not knowing is the desired state in a knowledge economy. So don't wait to figure things out. Do something small, act, cause ripples, evaluate the impact of those ripples, and then use that as determining what your next step would be, rather than sitting, thinking it out, making sense of what it's supposed to be, and then acting.
George here with us today, and we will continue the dialogue on Thai Talk if you'd like to share more. But I'd like everyone to join me in welcoming George for joining us today. So thank you.